Imagine trying to have sex while 10 people are watching, including your mother-in-law and a judgmental chicken. Welcome to medieval romance. This is the untold story of how love survived the Middle Ages, a time when the Catholic Church literally published a calendar of days you couldn't be intimate with your own spouse. What you're about to discover will shock you about how people actually lived, loved, and, well, let's just say the history books left out the juicy parts. We're diving deep into 1347 England, where privacy didn't exist, chastity belts were fake, and prostitution was government regulated. These stories have gone viral on TikTok, sparked debates in college classrooms across America, and changed how an entire generation thinks about relationships and sexual freedom. If you're ready for history that's actually honest about human nature, hit that subscribe button. Because tonight, we're starting with Thomas and Agnes, a couple whose biggest enemy wasn't war or plague. It was a chicken named Brunhilde. Where survival isn't just a challenge, it's a daily miracle that most people don't achieve for very long. Picture this. You're climbing down from a steam train at Victoria Station, your lungs immediately assaulted by air so thick with coal smoke and industrial pollution that you can literally taste the death hanging in the atmosphere around you. The year is 1885, and you've just arrived in the world's largest city, home to over 4 million souls, most of whom are living in conditions that would make a modern refugee camp look like a luxury resort. Victorian London wasn't just dirty or uncomfortable. It was actively trying to kill you through every possible means. Poisoned air, contaminated water, diseased food, collapsing buildings, deadly transportation, and a social system designed to grind the core into literal dust. You're about to discover that surviving even a single week in Victorian London required skills, luck, and resources that most residents simply didn't possess, which explains why the average life expectancy hovered around a terrifying 27 years for the working class. The reality is that Victorian London was essentially a massive death trap disguised as civilization's crowning achievement, where every basic human need, shelter, food, water, safety, came with potentially fatal consequences that would horrify anyone accustomed to modern urban living. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. I'd love to know where you're listening from tonight and what time it is in your corner of the world. Drop that in the comments and let's see how this Victorian nightmare is reaching across the globe. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're standing in the heart of the British Empire, surrounded by the greatest architectural achievements of the age, magnificent railway stations, towering government buildings, and elegant mansions that speak to unprecedented wealth and technological progress. But this impressive facade conceals an urban hellscape where human life is cheaper than coal, cleaner than the Thames, and more expendable than the factory equipment that's rapidly replacing traditional craftsmen throughout the city. Your first challenge is simply breathing the air around you, which contains a toxic mixture of coal smoke from millions of domestic fires, industrial pollution from hundreds of factories, and organic decay from inadequate sewage systems that turn London's atmosphere into a slow-acting poison that weakens your lungs and shortens your life with every breath. The famous London fog isn't just moisture, it's a deadly combination of water vapor and industrial pollution that regularly kills thousands of residents during particularly severe episodes. The sounds assaulting your ears include the constant clatter of iron-shod wheels on cobblestones, the shouting of street vendors trying to sell contaminated food, the cries of children working in conditions that would horrify modern labor inspectors, and the general cacophony of a city growing faster than its infrastructure can support. Victorian London was loud, crowded, and overwhelming in ways that make modern urban noise seem like peaceful background music. Your immediate priority is finding somewhere safe to sleep tonight, but this seemingly simple task will introduce you to housing conditions so appalling that they regularly claim lives through disease, fire, and structural collapse, making your search for shelter a desperate gamble with death itself. Welcome to medieval romance. This is the untold story of how love survived the Middle Ages, a time when the Catholic Church literally published a calendar of days you couldn't be intimate with your own spouse. What you're about to discover will shock you about how people actually lived, loved, and, well, let's just say the history books left out the juicy parts. We're diving deep into 1347 England, where privacy didn't exist, chastity belts were fake, and prostitution was government regulated. These stories have gone viral on TikTok, sparked debates in college classrooms across America, and changed how an entire generation thinks about relationships and sexual freedom. If you're ready for history that's actually honest about human nature, hit that subscribe button, because tonight we're starting with Thomas and Agnes, a couple whose biggest enemy wasn't war or plague, it was a chicken named Brunhilde. In an era when the Catholic Church published an actual calendar telling married couples exactly which days they were forbidden from being intimate. We're talking about a religious institution that managed to turn the calendar into the world's most comprehensive mood killer, where romance had to be scheduled around saints' feast days, liturgical seasons, and what can only be described as divine micromanagement of the bedroom. Welcome back to our journey through medieval love and lust. If you missed our last episode about privacy in crowded homes, there's a link in the description. And if you're enjoying these deep dives into history's most awkward moments, hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. Trust me, we're just getting started with the bizarre world of medieval romance. Let's travel to the year 1203 to the prosperous town of Chartres in northern France, where we meet Father Benedict, a young priest fresh from his theological training and absolutely bursting with enthusiasm for enforcing every single rule the church has ever written. At 26, Benedict has memorized canon law with the dedication of a modern law student preparing for the bar exam. Except his specialty isn't contracts or criminal justice. It's the intimate lives of married Christians. Father Benedict has just been assigned to serve the wealthy merchant class of Chartres, and among his new parishioners are Lord William de Montfort and his wife Lady Margaret. William is 32, a success. The church's position on marital intimacy was, to put it mildly, complicated. On one hand, they acknowledged that physical union between husband and wife was divinely ordained. After all, God had commanded Adam and Eve to be fruitful and multiply. On the other hand, they were deeply suspicious of any pleasure that might distract the soul from contemplating heavenly matters. The result was a system of regulations that would make modern tax law look simple by comparison. William first encounters this bureaucratic nightmare on a bright Tuesday morning in March when he visits Father Benedict for what he assumes will be a routine confession. Instead, he finds himself on the receiving end of a detailed lecture about the church's expectations for Christian marriage. Father Benedict, consulting a thick, leather-bound manual that looks like it could double as a weapon, begins to outline the various restrictions that will govern William's romantic life. Let us begin with the weekly prohibitions, Father Benedict announces, as if he's reading a grocery list rather than systematically destroying a man's love life. Sundays are forbidden, naturally, as they are the Lord's Day and must be devoted entirely to worship and contemplation. Fridays are also prohibited, as they commemorate our Savior's Passion and should be observed with penance and restraint. Wednesdays are discouraged, as they fall in the middle of the week and may disrupt the proper rhythm of prayer and fasting. William, who until this moment had considered Wednesday night his lucky night, feels his hopes beginning to crumble. But Father Benedict is just getting started. Then we have the seasonal restrictions, the priest continues, flipping through his manual with the enthusiasm of someone who genuinely enjoys delivering bad news. The 40 days of Lent are completely off limits, as Christians should be focused on spiritual purification and self-denial. The same applies to the 40 days of Advent, when we prepare our hearts for the coming of Christ. Add to that the various feast days of our Lord, Our Lady, and the saints, and you'll find that roughly half the year is designated for spiritual rather than carnal pursuits. William stares at the priest in growing horror. Half the year? He manages to whisper.
"Oh, we're not finished," Father Benedict replies cheerfully. "There are also the Ember Days, which occur 4 times a year and require 3 days of fasting and abstinence each. The vigils of major feasts must be observed with purity of body and soul." And naturally, anytime your wife is with child, recovering from childbirth, or experiencing her monthly courses, physical union is strictly forbidden. At this point, William is frantically calculating in his head, and the math is not working in his favor. "Father," he says slowly, "exactly how many days in the year are we actually permitted to be husband and wife?" Father Benedict consults his calendar with the precision of an accountant. "Well, if we remove Sundays, Fridays, most of Lent and Advent, the major feast days, the Ember Days, the Vigils, and account for the natural monthly cycles of feminine constitution, I would estimate perhaps 40 to 50 days per year, possibly fewer, if there are any special devotions or local saint days to observe." William feels the blood draining from his face. Margaret, he realizes, is going to have some very strong opinions about this development. The restrictions weren't arbitrary, at least not entirely. Church theologians had developed elaborate justifications for each prohibition, rooted in their understanding of human nature and divine will. Physical pleasure, they argued, was acceptable only when it served the higher purpose of procreation. Any enjoyment beyond what was necessary for the continuation of the human race was considered suspicious at best, sinful at worst. They believed that excessive passion, even between married couples, could corrupt the soul and distract believers from their primary purpose of seeking salvation. The ideal Christian marriage, according to these thinkers, was one of restraint, moderation, and constant awareness of spiritual priorities. Love was acceptable, lust was not. The challenge, of course, was defining exactly where one ended and the other began. Father Benedict, armed with his manuals and calendars, saw himself as a guardian of spiritual purity. He genuinely believed that by helping couples regulate their physical relationships, he was saving their souls and bringing them closer to God. The fact that this might make them miserable in the process was, in his view, beside the point. Earthly happiness was temporary. Eternal salvation was forever. When William returns home to break the news to Margaret, the conversation does not go well. Margaret, who comes from a family of successful merchants and is accustomed to making her own decisions about most aspects of her life, is not prepared to have her marriage regulated by a celibate priest with a calendar fetish. "He said what?" Margaret asks, her voice rising to a pitch that makes the servants in the kitchen pause in their work. William, who has been dreading this moment all day, repeats Father Benedict's instructions, while Margaret's expression progresses from disbelief to outrage to something that might charitably be called homicidal fury. "So let me understand this correctly," Margaret says with the dangerous calm of a woman who is about to unleash years of stored frustration. "This priest, who has never been married, never kissed a woman, and probably doesn't know the first thing about what it means to love someone with your whole heart, is going to tell us when we can and cannot express our love for each other? It's church law," William says weakly, though he's beginning to suspect that this argument isn't going to carry much weight with his wife. "Church law," Margaret repeats. "And what exactly happens if we ignore this ridiculous calendar of his?" This, as it turns out, is where things get really interesting. The church's enforcement mechanisms were surprisingly sophisticated for the medieval period. Priests were instructed to ask pointed questions during confession, not just about spiritual matters, but about the intimate details of married life. Couples who were suspected of violating the sexual calendar could be subjected to public penance, fines, or even temporary excommunication. In some regions, church officials appointed lay monitors, whose job was to keep track of suspicious behavior among married couples. These unofficial moral police would report anything that seemed to indicate excessive passion or disregard for the prescribed calendar. The result was a system where neighbors might spy on neighbors, and intimate relationships became matters of public scrutiny. But here's the fascinating thing about human nature. The more authority tries to control it, the more creative people become in finding ways around the rules. William and Margaret, like countless couples across medieval Europe, quickly discovered that there was often a significant gap between official church policy and local enforcement. Father Benedict, for all his enthusiasm, was responsible for dozens of families in Chartres. He couldn't possibly monitor everyone's bedroom activities, and frankly, Most priests preferred not to think too hard about the intimate lives of their parishioners. The result was a system that worked more on the honor system than on actual surveillance. Moreover, different regions interpreted the rules differently. What was strictly forbidden in one diocese might be overlooked in another. Priests who were more focused on pastoral care than legal enforcement often turned a blind eye to minor violations, especially if the couples involved were otherwise devout and generous to the church. Chartres, as part of his travels between monasteries. Brother Matthias has spent 30 years in religious life and has developed what might charitably be called a more nuanced view of human relationships. The calendar is a guideline, he tells them quietly one evening after dinner, when Father Benedict is safely occupied with his evening prayers. It's meant to encourage spiritual discipline, not to make married couples miserable. God created love, including physical love between husband and wife. Do you really think he wants his children to be unhappy? This conversation opens up a whole new perspective for William and Margaret. They begin to understand that the Church's rules, while officially absolute, are interpreted and enforced by human beings who bring their own wisdom, experience, and compassion to bear on difficult situations. Gradually, they develop their own approach to navigating the ecclesiastical calendar. They observe the major restrictions, Lent and Advent, the most important feast days, but treat the more minor prohibitions as suggestions rather than absolute laws. They're careful to be discreet, generous in their donations to the Church, and scrupulous about attending services and observing their other religious duties. Most importantly, they learn to read Father Benedict. When he's in one of his rule-enforcing moods, they're extra careful to appear properly penitent and spiritually focused. When he's preoccupied with other parish matters, they allow themselves more latitude. It's a delicate dance, but one that thousands of medieval couples mastered out of necessity. The experience teaches them something valuable about the difference between the letter of the law and the spirit of it. The Church's intention, they realize, isn't to destroy love, but to sanctify it, to help couples understand that their relationship is about more than just physical attraction. The calendar, however cumbersome, is meant to encourage them to build a marriage based on companionship, mutual respect, and shared spiritual values as well as physical desire. But even as William and Margaret learn to navigate the Church's calendar of restrictions, they're about to discover that finding time for romance is only the beginning of their challenges. Because in medieval Europe, love wasn't just regulated by religious authorities. It was complicated by family expectations, social pressures, and a system of arranged marriages that treated romance as a luxury most people couldn't afford. Negotiate your romantic future like they're trading livestock at a county fair. Your compatibility would be measured not in shared interests or physical attraction, but in acres of farmland, number of goats owned, and whether your family has a history of producing male heirs. Welcome to medieval matchmaking, where love was a luxury and marriage was a business transaction with a side of political maneuvering. If you're just joining us on this journey through the romantic disasters of the past, make sure to check out our previous episodes in the description below. And if you're finding these historical deep dives as fascinating as I am, hit that like button and subscribe for more stories that will make you grateful for modern dating, no matter how complicated it seems. Let's step into the year 1184, in the rolling hills of Yorkshire, England, where we meet Emma de Clare, a spirited 16-year-old with auburn hair, green eyes that sparkle with intelligence, and the misfortune of being born into a family that sees her primarily as a valuable commodity to be traded at the right moment for the right price. Emma lives in Ravenshollow Castle, a modest keep owned by her father, Sir Edmund de Clare, a minor baron who's managed to accumulate some wealth through careful management of his lands, but finds himself in increasingly desperate financial straits. The harvest has been poor for 2 consecutive years. His tenants are struggling to pay their rents, and he owes significant money to several powerful neighbors who are growing impatient with his promises of future payment. Emma, blissfully unaware of her father's financial troubles, has spent her days learning to read and write, unusual for a woman of her time, helping her mother manage the household and sneaking off to the village whenever possible to visit the market and practice her growing independence. It's during one of these unauthorized adventures that she meets Robert Miller, the 20-year-old son of the local grain merchant. Robert is everything that medieval society would consider inappropriate for a baron's daughter. He's a commoner, the son of a tradesman, with no land, no title, and no prospects beyond eventually inheriting his father's mill. He's also kind, intelligent, funny, and possesses the sort of gentle strength that comes from honest work. When Emma accidentally drops her purse while bargaining for ribbons at the market, Robert is the one who retrieves it, and their eyes meet in what can only be described as the medieval equivalent of a meet-cute. What follows is a series of carefully orchestrated accidental encounters. Emma finds excuses to visit the market more frequently. Robert times his deliveries to the castle to coincide with her daily walks. They exchange shy smiles, then brief conversations, then longer talks about books, dreams, and the world beyond the narrow confines of their social positions. Within weeks, they're hopelessly, completely, and utterly inappropriately in love. Meanwhile, Sir Edmund is facing a crisis that makes his daughter's romantic inclinations completely irrelevant to his calculations. His largest creditor, Sir Geoffrey of Blackmore, a 45-year-old knight with vast holdings, 3 grown sons from his deceased first wife, and a reputation for both military prowess and financial ruthlessness, has made it clear that Sir Edmund's debts must be settled immediately, or else. Sir Geoffrey is not a cruel man exactly, but he's practical in the way that powerful men often are when dealing with those who owe them money. He's willing to forgive Sir Edmund's debts entirely, along with a generous additional payment in exchange for something that Sir Edmund possesses and Sir Geoffrey wants: a young, well-born wife who can provide him with additional heirs and help manage his increasingly complex household. The negotiation takes place in Sir Edmund's study on a gray November morning, with rain drumming against the narrow windows and a fire crackling in the stone hearth. Sir Geoffrey, a large man with graying hair and hands scarred from decades of swordplay, sits across from Sir Edmund and lays out his proposal with the matter-of-fact tone of someone discussing the purchase of a horse. Your daughter Emma is of good breeding, appropriate age, and from what I've observed, possesses both intelligence and beauty. Sir Geoffrey begins, as if Emma were standing right there instead of being discussed like a piece of property. A marriage alliance would solve your immediate financial difficulties and provide my household with a capable mistress. The girl would want for nothing. My lands are extensive, my household well managed, and I'm not an unreasonable husband. Sir Edmund, who genuinely loves his daughter but loves solvency more, finds himself in the position of fathers throughout history who must choose between their children's happiness and their family's survival. The math is brutal but simple. Emma's marriage to Sir Geoffrey solves every problem the family faces, while her personal preferences are, in the grand scheme of medieval life, irrelevant luxuries. She's young yet, Sir Edmund says weakly, though he already knows how this conversation will end. Old enough, Sir Geoffrey replies, and young enough to adapt to my household and bear healthy children. I'm not seeking a love match, Edmund. I'm seeking a practical arrangement that benefits both our families. Your daughter will be Lady of Blackmore, with servants, fine clothes, and security for life. Many girls would consider that a considerable improvement over uncertainty. The betrothal is announced at dinner that same evening, and Emma's reaction is everything her father feared it would be. She doesn't cry or plead or throw a dramatic fit. Instead, she sits in stunned silence as her entire future is reshaped without her consultation. Her face growing pale as she realizes that her childhood has just ended and her adult life has been decided by men who've never asked her opinion about anything more significant than what she'd like for breakfast. Sir Geoffrey is a good man, her mother, Lady Catherine, says later that evening as she tries to comfort her daughter. He's wealthy, he's honorable, and he'll treat you well. You'll have everything you could want, except the right to choose. Emma replies quietly, staring out her narrow window at the village below, where she knows Robert is probably wondering why she didn't appear at the market that day. Choice is a luxury we can't afford, Lady Catherine responds, and there's genuine sadness in her voice, because she too was married for practical reasons, and has spent 20 years making the best of a situation she never chose. Love can grow, Emma, and even if it doesn't, security and respect are not small things. But Emma, who has tasted the possibility of choosing her own path and found it intoxicating, is not prepared to accept this medieval version of settling. Over the next several days, she develops what can only be described as the medieval equivalent of an escape plan. She and Robert, meeting in secret in the old mill after midnight, discuss the possibility of eloping, running away together, and starting a new life somewhere beyond the reach of both their families. It's a romantic plan with absolutely no basis in medieval reality. They have no money, no connections outside their immediate area, and no understanding of how difficult life would be for a runaway baron's daughter and a miller's son with no resources beyond their love for each other. But they're young, desperate, and convinced that somehow their affection for each other will overcome the harsh practicalities of medieval economics. The plan falls apart spectacularly on the night before Emma's formal betrothal ceremony. As they're preparing to steal away in the pre-dawn darkness, they're discovered by Sir Edmund's guards, who have been watching Emma more carefully than she realized. The confrontation takes place in the castle courtyard, with torches casting dramatic shadows on the stone walls, and Robert facing down armed men, who have every legal right to kill him for attempting to steal a baron's daughter. Sir Edmund, roused from his bed and furious at this threat to his carefully negotiated solution to his financial problems, initially threatens to have Robert hanged for attempted kidnapping. In medieval law, what Robert has done, attempting to run away with a nobleman's daughter without permission, is essentially theft of valuable property, punishable by death. But here's where the story takes an unexpected turn that reveals something important about medieval character and the complexity of human nature even in harsh times. Sir Geoffrey, summoned to the castle to witness the resolution of this crisis, surprises everyone by interceding on Robert's behalf. Perhaps it's because Sir Geoffrey sees something of his own youth in Robert's desperate courage. Perhaps it's because he recognizes genuine love when he sees it, having once been young himself. Or perhaps it's simply because he's secure enough in his own position that he can afford to be magnanimous. Whatever his motivation, Sir Geoffrey makes a counter-proposal that astonishes everyone present. The boy loves her, he says soapily, looking at Robert, who's standing defiantly despite being outnumbered and outranked by everyone in the courtyard. And she loves him. I have no interest in a wife who will spend every day of our marriage wishing she were somewhere else with someone else. He turns to Sir Edmund. I'll still settle your debts, but not in exchange for your daughter. Instead, I'll purchase the mill and surrounding lands from Robert's father at a generous price. Generous enough to clear your obligations and provide Robert's family with sufficient funds to relocate wherever they choose. Sir Edmund keeps his lands and his honor. Robert and Emma get their freedom and enough money to start a life together, though they'll have to leave Yorkshire forever. Sir Geoffrey maintains his reputation for fairness and avoids a marriage that would likely make everyone miserable. The wedding of Emma and Robert takes place 3 months later in a small church 50 miles south of Ravenshollow, far from the complications of their former lives. It's a simple ceremony with few witnesses, but the love between the bride and groom is evident to everyone present. They've learned something valuable about the price of following your heart in a world that expects you to follow the rules instead. But their story, while it ends happily, illustrates the harsh reality that most medieval people faced when it came to marriage and love. For every Emma and Robert who found a way to choose each other, there were hundreds of couples who learned to make the best of arrangements made by their parents, their lords, or the practical necessities of survival. Medieval marriage was rarely about romance, but that doesn't mean medieval people didn't understand love or long for it. It simply means they had to find it within the constraints of a social system that prioritized family alliances, economic stability, and political advantage over personal preference. Many couples did find love within arranged marriages, learning to appreciate and care for each other over time. Others learned to coexist respectfully while finding emotional fulfillment in friendships, religion, or their children. The tension between individual desire and social expectation that Emma and Robert experienced was a constant theme in medieval life, and it extended far beyond marriage into every aspect of personal behavior. Because even when couples did manage to find love, whether within arranged marriages or despite them, they still had to navigate a complex system of social expectations about how that love should be expressed, including some very specific and invasive ideas about proving that love was pure and appropriate. Which brings us to one of the most persistent and problematic myths about medieval relationships, a story that has captured imaginations for centuries but has very little basis in historical reality: the legend of the chastity belt. Literally measured by an intact hymen, and when virginity was considered more important than intelligence, kindness, or even basic survival skills. Imagine the pressure of your wedding night being less about romance and more about providing forensic evidence to satisfy a crowd of in-laws, church officials, and political allies. Welcome to medieval purity culture, where love took a back seat to anatomy, and a single night could make or break alliances that had taken years to negotiate. If you're following along with our journey through the bizarre world of medieval romance, make sure you've caught up with our previous episodes about privacy problems, church calendar restrictions, and marriage auctions. And if these historical deep dives are keeping you entertained, hit that subscribe button because we're about to dive into one of the most invasive and problematic aspects of medieval marriage customs. Let's travel to the year 1267, to the prosperous Duchy of Aquitaine in southern France, where we meet Isabella de Montpellier, a 17-year-old noblewoman whose wedding day should be the happiest day of her life, but has instead become something resembling a medieval medical examination, combined with a public trial. Isabella is beautiful, intelligent, well-educated in Latin and literature, and possessed of the kind of sharp wit that makes her both charming in conversation and dangerous to those who underestimate her. She's about to marry Duke Alfonso of Toulouse, a 30-year-old nobleman who controls vast territories, commands respect throughout southern France, and has the unfortunate personality trait of being deeply suspicious about everything and everyone. Alfonso is not inherently cruel, but he's the product of a political system where betrayal is common, alliances shift constantly, and trust is a luxury that powerful men can rarely afford. The marriage between Isabella and Alfonso represents more than just a romantic union. It's a carefully negotiated political alliance between two powerful families, designed to unite their territories, strengthen their military positions, and create a bloc of power that can resist the growing influence of the French crown. The success of this alliance depends heavily on the legitimacy of any children born to the union, which means that Isabella's virginity isn't just a personal matter, it's a political necessity. The trouble begins 3 weeks before the wedding, when a rumor starts circulating through the courts of southern France. Someone, and no one can quite identify who, claims to have seen Isabella in what they describe as a compromising situation with a young troubadour named Bertrand, who had been performing at her father's court the previous summer. The rumor is vague, unsubstantiated, and probably completely false, but in the world of medieval politics, perception often matters more than reality. Alfonso receives word of this rumor while he's traveling to Montpellier for the wedding ceremony, and his reaction is swift and predictable. He demands that Isabella be examined by experts to verify her virginity before the wedding proceeds. This isn't just paranoia on his part. In medieval noble marriages, questions about a bride's purity could be used later to annul the marriage, declare any children illegitimate, and seize back territories that had been transferred as part of the dowry agreement. Isabella's father, Lord Arnaud de Montpellier, finds himself in an impossible position. Refusing Alfonso's demand would essentially confirm the rumors and destroy the alliance. Agreeing to it subjects his daughter to a humiliating examination based on medieval medical knowledge that was somewhere between primitive and completely fictional. But with the political and economic future of his entire family at stake, Lord Arnaud reluctantly agrees to the examination.
Enter Madame Beatrice, a woman whose official title is Wise Woman, but whose actual job description is far more specific and invasive. Beatrice has made a career out of examining young women for various noble families throughout Aquitaine, using a combination of folk wisdom, religious superstition, and complete medical ignorance to pronounce judgment on matters that would challenge even modern gynecologists. Beatrice is a woman in her 50s, with sharp eyes, quick hands, and absolutely no understanding of female anatomy beyond what she's learned through years of invasive examinations and wild speculation. She believes, as do most people of her time, that virginity can be determined through physical inspection, that certain behaviors can damage a woman's purity even without sexual contact, and that moral character can be detected through bodily examination. The examination takes place in Isabella's private chambers, with her mother and 2 other noblewomen present as witnesses. The process is humiliating, painful, and completely unscientific, but Beatrice approaches it with the confidence of someone who has never been challenged on her expertise. She pokes, prods, makes pronouncements about what she sees, and generally treats Isabella like a piece of livestock being evaluated for purchase. After what feels like hours but is probably only minutes, Beatrice emerges from the examination with a verdict that satisfies no one. She claims that while Isabella shows signs of purity, there are certain irregularities that could indicate either innocence or experience, depending on how one interprets the evidence. In other words, Beatrice has delivered the medieval equivalent of results inconclusive, which does absolutely nothing to resolve Alfonso's suspicions or Isabella's humiliation. Word of Beatrice's ambiguous findings reaches Alfonso just hours before the wedding ceremony is scheduled to begin, and his reaction is predictably dramatic. He announces that he cannot proceed with the marriage until the questions about Isabella's purity are definitively resolved. This creates a crisis that threatens not just the wedding, but the entire political alliance between the 2 families. Isabella, who has endured weeks of rumors, a humiliating examination, and now the very public questioning of her character, finally reaches her breaking point. In a scene that would be dramatic in any century, she confronts Alfonso directly in front of both families, the assembled wedding guests, and several important political observers who have traveled from across France to witness the ceremony. You question my honor based on the gossip of people who do not know me, and the pronouncements of a woman who judges virtue by examining the most private parts of a person's body, Isabella declares, her voice carrying clearly across the great hall of her father's castle. If you cannot take my word as a woman of noble birth, if you trust rumors more than you trust me, and if you believe that my worth as a wife can be determined by a medical examination, then perhaps you are not the man I should marry. It's a speech that would be impressive in any era, but in medieval France, where women are expected to be submissive and accepting of male authority, it's nothing short of revolutionary. Isabella is essentially challenging not just Alfonso's right to question her, but the entire system that treats women's bodies as property to be inspected and verified by others. Alfonso, faced with this unexpected defiance from a woman he expected to be grateful for his attention, has to make a quick decision. He can insist on his demands and risk looking like a tyrant who bullies young women based on unfounded rumors, or he can back down and risk appearing weak in front of important political allies. The entire future of the alliance hangs in the balance of this moment. Here's where the story takes an interesting turn that reveals something important about medieval character and the power of personal courage, even in restrictive times. Alfonso, perhaps impressed by Isabella's spirit, perhaps recognizing the weakness of his own position, or perhaps simply realizing that a wife with this much backbone might actually be an asset in the dangerous world of medieval politics, chooses to back down. Your words show both courage and honor, he says, though whether he means it or is simply making the best of a bad situation is unclear. A woman who can defend herself so eloquently will surely be able to defend our interests just as effectively. If you are willing to forgive my suspicions, I am willing to proceed with our marriage based on trust rather than examination. The wedding proceeds, but the damage to their relationship has been done. Isabella goes through the ceremony and the reception with dignity, but those who know her well can see the anger and hurt in her eyes. She has learned something valuable and painful about the world she lives in and the man she has married. That her word means less than gossip, her dignity less than political convenience, and her feelings less than the opinions of strangers. The wedding night itself becomes another trial by ordeal, with both families waiting anxiously for the proof that medieval tradition demanded. Isabella's personal maid, Anna, who has served her family for years and understands the political implications of this moment, takes matters into her own hands. Using a combination of theatrical skills and strategic planning that would impress modern stage managers, Anna ensures that the required evidence appears on the bedsheets, regardless of what actually transpires between Isabella and Alfonso. Both families to proceed with their alliance, but Isabella has learned a hard lesson about the gap between the romantic ideals of courtly love literature and the brutal realities of medieval marriage politics. Over the following months, Isabella and Alfonso do manage to build a working relationship that eventually grows into something resembling affection, though it never quite becomes the passionate love that Isabella had dreamed of in her youth. They learn to respect each other's intelligence, rely on each other's strengths, and work together to manage their combined territories effectively. But Isabella never forgets the humiliation of having her worth reduced to a medical examination, her character questioned based on rumors, and her feelings dismissed as irrelevant to more important political considerations. She uses her experience to advocate quietly for other young women in similar situations, offering support and practical advice to brides facing their own trials by ordeal. Her story illustrates the impossible position that medieval women faced when it came to questions of purity and virtue. They were expected to be simultaneously innocent and knowledgeable, passive and strong, pure and practical. They had to navigate a system that valued them primarily for their reproductive capacity, while also expecting them to be intelligent partners in complex political and economic arrangements. The obsession with female virginity in medieval culture wasn't just about morality or religion. It was about property, inheritance, and political control. A woman's sexual history could determine whether her children were considered legitimate heirs, whether her marriage could be annulled for political convenience, and whether her family's alliances would be honored or abandoned. But the methods used to verify virginity were based on medical ignorance and social prejudice rather than scientific knowledge. The physical signs that medieval people believed indicated virginity could be affected by physical activity, medical conditions, or simply normal variations in anatomy. The examinations were invasive, humiliating, and completely unreliable as indicators of sexual experience. More importantly, the entire system was based on the assumption that a woman's worth was determined by her sexual history, rather than her character, intelligence, or capabilities. It reduced complex human beings to simple categories of pure or impure, ignoring the reality that virtue and value come from how people treat others, not from their physical condition. Isabella's story shows both the crushing weight of these expectations and the possibility of finding dignity and strength even within oppressive systems. Her courage in confronting Alfonso demonstrates that even in medieval times, some women found ways to assert their worth and demand respect, even when the entire social system was designed to deny them both. But even as we admire Isabella's courage and sympathize with her struggles, we're about to discover that some of the most persistent myths about medieval attempts to control women's sexuality are exactly that, myths. The story of the chastity belt, one of the most famous symbols of medieval oppression, turns out to be far more fiction than fact. I have some prime oceanfront property in medieval Switzerland to sell you. The chastity belt is one of history's most persistent myths, right up there with the idea that people thought the earth was flat and that everyone died at age 30. It's a story so compelling, so perfectly dramatic, and so satisfying to our modern assumptions about medieval oppression that we've kept telling it for centuries, despite the fact that there's virtually no historical evidence that it ever actually happened on any significant scale. Welcome back to our exploration of medieval myths and realities. If you've been following our journey through the crowded bedrooms, church calendars, marriage negotiations, and virginity trials of the Middle Ages, you know we're committed to separating historical fact from historical fiction. And today we're tackling one of the biggest fictional stories of them all. Don't forget to subscribe if you're enjoying these myth-busting episodes, and leave a comment about which historical misconception you'd like us to tackle next. Let's travel to Venice in the year 1547, which is technically the Renaissance, rather than the medieval period. But this distinction is important, because it's precisely when and where some of the chastity belt myths were actually created. Here we meet Marco Benedetti, a skilled metalworker whose shop sits along one of the bustling canals that wind through the heart of the Merchant Republic. Marco specializes in fine jewelry, decorative armor, and the kind of intricate metalwork that wealthy Venetians use to display their prosperity and artistic sophistication. Marco is a craftsman who takes pride in his work, whether he's creating a delicate silver necklace for a merchant's daughter, or an ornate ceremonial sword for a nobleman's collection. He's also a practical man who understands the difference between functional metalwork and purely decorative pieces. So when a wealthy but somewhat eccentric customer approaches him with an unusual commission, Marco's professional instincts immediately tell him that something is very wrong with the request. The customer, who introduces himself as Count Alessandro di Rimini, claims to represent a noble family that wishes to commission what he describes as a device for ensuring wifely virtue during extended absences. He provides Marco with a crude drawing of what appears to be an iron belt with locks, chains, and various uncomfortable-looking metal appendages. Count Alessandro explains that he's heard such devices were commonly used in the olden days and wants to have one recreated for his own family's use. Marco, who has spent his entire career working with metal and understanding how it interacts with the human body, takes one look at the proposed design and immediately recognizes several serious problems. First, the device would be completely impossible to wear for more than a few hours without causing serious injury, infection, or death. Second, the locking mechanisms described in the drawing would be easily defeated by anyone with basic lockpicking skills. Third, and most obviously, the entire concept violates basic principles of hygiene, human anatomy, and practical engineering. Signor, Marco says carefully, trying to be respectful while also being honest, I must tell you that such a device would be not only impractical, but genuinely dangerous. The human body requires certain basic functions for health and survival, and any device that prevents these functions would quickly become life-threatening. Count Alessandro waves away these concerns with the confidence of someone who has never actually thought about the practical implications of his request. Surely the smiths of old found ways to address such problems. He insists, I've heard many stories of knights who used such devices to ensure their wives' faithfulness during the Crusades. This conversation reveals something important about how historical myths develop and spread. Count Alessandro has heard stories, probably from other people who have also never seen an actual chastity belt, and he assumes that these stories must be based on historical fact. He's fallen victim to what historians call circular citation, where a story becomes true simply because it's been repeated often enough, regardless of whether there's any actual evidence to support it. Marco decides to investigate these claims by consulting with other metalworkers, examining old records, and researching the historical traditions of his craft. What he discovers is both fascinating and revealing. There are virtually no references to chastity belts in medieval documents, no surviving examples from the medieval period, and no evidence that such devices were ever manufactured or used on any significant scale
during the supposed golden age of chivalry. Instead, Marco finds that most of the historical chastity belts that exist in museums and private collections were actually created during the Renaissance or later, often as curiosities, jokes, or fantasy items rather than functional devices. Some were made as satirical commentary on marriage and relationships, others as exotic conversation pieces for wealthy collectors, and still others as props for theatrical performances or erotic literature. The more Marco researches, the more he realizes that the entire chastity belt mythology is largely a Renaissance and post-Renaissance invention, created by people who wanted to believe that the medieval period was more extreme, more oppressive, and more dramatically different from their own time than it actually was. The chastity belt serves as a perfect symbol of imagined medieval barbarism, allowing later generations to feel superior and more enlightened by comparison. Marco's investigation leads him to Brother Tommaso, an elderly monk who serves as the librarian at one of Venice's oldest monasteries and has spent decades studying medieval manuscripts. Brother Tommaso confirms Marco's suspicions with the enthusiasm of a scholar who enjoys debunking popular misconceptions. The medieval period was certainly harsh by our standards, Brother Tommaso explains, but it was harsh in practical ways: war, disease, economic hardship, political instability. The idea that medieval men would have invented elaborate metal devices to control their wives' sexuality is actually quite fantastical when you consider the realities of medieval life.
Brother Tommaso points out several practical problems with the chastity belt myth that go beyond Marco's engineering concerns. Medieval knights, when they went to war, were typically gone for months or even years at a time. Any device that prevented basic bodily functions would have killed the wearer within days. Medieval medicine had no understanding of antiseptics or infection control, so any device that created wounds or prevented proper hygiene would have been essentially a death sentence. Moreover, medieval women were not passive decoration, waiting around in castles for their husbands to return. They were actively involved in managing estates, running businesses, making political alliances, and handling the complex logistics of medieval economic life. A woman locked in a chastity belt would have been unable to perform any of these essential functions, effectively crippling her family's interests while her husband was away. Medieval society was brutal and often unfair to women. Brother Tommaso continues, but it was brutal in practical ways. Women were controlled through law, custom, economic dependence, and social pressure, not through elaborate mechanical devices that would have been both impractical and counterproductive. Marco shares his research with Count Alessandro, explaining not only why he can't create the requested device, but why such devices were never actually used in the way that popular stories suggest. Count Alessandro, initially disappointed, becomes fascinated by the gap between myth and reality. He commissions Marco instead to create a detailed report on the historical evidence surrounding chastity belts, which becomes something of a sensation among Venice's intellectual community. The report reveals that most historical chastity belts can be traced to much later periods and specific cultural contexts. Some were created as medical devices for treating certain conditions, others as theatrical props, and still others as elaborate practical jokes or satirical commentary. The few surviving examples that are genuinely old tend to be either medical apparatus or items created for very specific, limited purposes rather than widespread marital control. Marco's investigation also uncovers something interesting about human psychology and historical mythology. People want to believe in chastity belts because they provide a simple, dramatic symbol for complex, historical realities. The actual ways that medieval society controlled women's sexuality, through legal systems, economic dependence, social surveillance, and cultural pressure, are more subtle and harder to visualize than a dramatic iron device with locks and keys. The chastity belt myth serves a psychological need for both medieval fantasy and moral superiority. It allows people to imagine the medieval period as more extreme and dramatic than it actually was, while also feeling good about how much more enlightened and humane modern society is by comparison. It's the perfect historical myth
because it's just plausible enough to seem possible while being dramatic enough to capture the imagination, to control sexuality and ensure fidelity. These methods were far more sophisticated and effective than any mechanical device could have been, precisely because they worked with human psychology and social dynamics rather than against basic human physiology. Medieval women were controlled through a complex web of surveillance, reputation management, and economic dependence that made infidelity both practically difficult and socially catastrophic. In small communities, everyone knew everyone else's business, and any suspicious behavior would quickly become public knowledge. Women who were caught in affairs could face social ostracism, economic ruin, physical punishment, or even death, depending on their social status and local customs. More importantly, medieval marriages were typically embedded in larger networks of family alliances, economic partnerships, and political relationships that made fidelity a matter of family honor rather than just personal choice. A woman who violated these expectations wasn't just betraying her husband, she was potentially destroying carefully negotiated alliances that affected entire extended families and communities. These social control mechanisms were far more effective than any physical device could have been, because they addressed the emotional and psychological aspects of human relationships, rather than just the physical ones. They also allowed for the flexibility and complexity that real human relationships require, while still maintaining the social order that medieval communities needed to function. Marco's final report concludes that the chastity belt myth says more about the people who believe in it than about the medieval period itself. Each generation has reimagined the medieval past to serve its own psychological and cultural needs, creating myths that reflect contemporary anxieties about sexuality, gender, and social control, rather than historical realities. The Renaissance creators of chastity belt myths were dealing with their own anxieties about changing gender roles and social hierarchies. Victorian collectors who popularized these myths were projecting their own sexual repressions and fantasies onto an imagined medieval past. Modern people who continue to believe in chastity belts are often looking for simple explanations for complex historical phenomena or dramatic symbols for subtle social realities. Marco's investigation transforms him from a simple craftsman into something of a historical detective, and his report becomes influential in scholarly circles throughout northern Italy. More importantly, it helps establish a pattern of critical thinking about historical claims that would become increasingly important as Renaissance scholars began to develop more rigorous methods for studying the past. The story of Marco's investigation reveals something crucial about how we understand history and how myths develop and spread. The most persistent historical myths are often the ones that serve psychological or cultural needs for the people who believe in them, regardless of whether they're supported by actual evidence. The chastity belt myth persists because it provides a satisfying narrative about medieval oppression and modern progress, not because it reflects historical reality. But if chastity belts weren't actually locking up medieval wives, what was really happening in the bedrooms and brothels of medieval Europe? As we're about to discover, the reality of medieval sexuality was far more complex, contradictory, and surprising than any simple myth could capture. Because while knights weren't locking up their wives, medieval cities were doing something equally surprising, officially licensing and regulating their prostitutes. Purity was preached from every pulpit, and when adultery could be punished by public humiliation or death, there existed a thriving industry that operated with full government approval, complete tax collection, and official municipal oversight. Welcome to the world of licensed medieval prostitution, where the same authorities who condemned sexual impropriety on Sunday were collecting rental income from brothels on Monday, and moral flexibility was just another tool of practical governance. If you've been following our journey through the contradictions and complexities of medieval love and lust, you know we're committed to exploring the gap between official morality and actual practice. Make sure you're subscribed, because we're diving deep into one of history's most fascinating examples of institutional hypocrisy. And trust me, the medieval Catholic Church's relationship with prostitution will make your head spin faster than a confession booth revolving door. Let's step into the bustling city of Avignon in the year 1348.
during the period when the papal court resided in France rather than Rome. This is a city where religious authority and secular power intersect in ways that create fascinating contradictions, and where moral theory meets economic reality with results that would shock the faithful and amuse the cynical in equal measure. Our central figure is Madame Marguerite de Provence, a woman in her 40s who has built one of the most successful and well-respected businesses in Avignon, a licensed brothel that operates under the direct protection of the municipal authorities and pays regular taxes to both the city and, indirectly, to the very church that officially condemns her profession. Marguerite is intelligent, well-connected, politically savvy, and possessed of the kind of practical wisdom that comes from years of navigating the complex relationships between power, money, and human desire. Marguerite's establishment, known euphemistically as the House of the Golden Rose, occupies a substantial building in one of Avignon's designated red light districts. The building itself is well maintained, clean by medieval standards, and staffed with women who work under regulated conditions that, while hardly ideal by modern standards, represent a significant improvement over the alternatives available to most women in similar circumstances. The regulatory system governing Marguerite's business is surprisingly sophisticated for the medieval period. The city requires annual licensing fees, regular health inspections, such as they were understood at the time, and compliance with specific rules about operating hours, customer behavior, and treatment of workers. The brothel must close during major religious holidays, cannot operate within a certain distance of churches or schools, and must follow strict guidelines about noise, public disturbance, and advertising. Into this carefully regulated world of sanctioned sin steps Brother Francis, a young Franciscan monk who has recently arrived in Avignon as part of a delegation from Rome. Francis is 28 years old, deeply devout, and absolutely convinced that his mission is to bring spiritual purity and moral clarity to a world that has lost its way. He's also naive in the way that only sheltered religious intellectuals can be, with very little understanding of how the world actually works outside monastery walls. Brother Francis first becomes aware of the contradiction between church teaching and municipal practice when he discovers that the monastery where he's staying receives rental income from properties throughout the city, including several buildings that house what the account books euphemistically describe as houses of hospitality for traveling merchants. When Francis inquires about the nature of these establishments, his older brothers in the monastery become evasive and suggest that he focus on his prayers rather than the complex financial arrangements that keep their community fed and housed. But Francis, possessed of the kind of moral curiosity that makes young idealists both admirable and dangerous, decides to investigate these houses of hospitality for himself. His first visit to the district where Marguerite's establishment operates is something of a culture shock. He expects to find obvious vice and degradation, but instead discovers a neighborhood that operates much like any other commercial district, with businesses that maintain regular hours, serve established clientele, and contribute to the local economy in measurable ways. When Francis finally confronts Marguerite directly, expecting to deliver a stern lecture about sin and redemption, he instead finds himself on the receiving end of an education about medieval economics, social policy, and the gap between religious theory and practical governance. Marguerite, who has dealt with morally outraged clergy before, receives Francis in her private office with the patience of someone explaining basic facts to a confused child. "Young brother," she begins, settling herself in a chair that speaks of both comfort and authority, "I understand your concerns about the moral implications of my profession. But before you condemn what you see here, perhaps you should understand why it exists and how it serves purposes that your church leaders understand, even if they don't discuss them publicly." Marguerite proceeds to explain the economic and social logic behind licensed prostitution in medieval cities. She points out that Avignon, like most urban centers, attracts large numbers of unmarried men, merchants, soldiers, craftsmen, pilgrims, and yes, clergy, who spend extended periods away from home and family. These men have natural desires that don't disappear simply because they're traveling, or because church doctrine disapproves of extramarital sex.
The choice, Marguerite explains, is not between sin and virtue. The choice is between regulated sin and unregulated sin. Would you prefer that these men pursue married women, creating adultery and family destruction? Would you rather they assault innocent girls, creating victims and social chaos? Or would you prefer that they visit establishments like mine, where the activities are consensual, regulated, and contained within specific boundaries?
This argument, Frances realizes with growing discomfort, is not just Marguerite's personal rationalization. It's the official position of the municipal authorities who license her establishment and the church officials who tacitly approve of the system. The licensed brothels of medieval Europe were not underground operations operating in defiance of authority. They were deliberate policy choices made by pragmatic leaders who understood that human sexuality couldn't be eliminated by moral pronouncements alone. Mayor Guillaume de Montpellier, the chief municipal authority in Avignon, explains the official position when Francis approaches him seeking clarification about city policy. The mayor is a practical man who has spent years balancing religious expectations with social realities, and he's surprisingly forthcoming about the reasoning behind the licensing system. Brother Francis, the mayor says, the church teaches us that lust is a sin, and we accept this teaching. But the church also teaches us that we live in a fallen world where sin is inevitable, and that good governance requires us to minimize harm rather than pretend that we can eliminate human weakness entirely. Licensed brothels allow us to control and contain activities that would otherwise occur in more dangerous and destructive ways. The mayor points out that cities without regulated prostitution tend to have higher rates of rape, adultery, and sexual assault, as well as more problems with disease transmission and social disorder. The licensing system allows authorities to monitor health conditions, prevent exploitation of minors, collect taxes for public services, and maintain social order by channeling potentially disruptive activities into controlled environments. Moreover, the mayor continues, many of the women who work in these establishments do so by choice, as an alternative to poverty, servitude, or arranged marriages to men they despise. Madame Marguerite's house provides them with protection, regular income, and working conditions that are better than what most women of their social class can expect in other occupations. This last point proves to be particularly challenging for Francis's worldview. When he speaks directly with some of the women working at the House of the Golden Rose, he discovers that their stories are more complex than his simple moral categories can accommodate. Some are indeed victims of circumstances beyond their control. Widows with no family support, refugees from war or famine, women abandoned by families who couldn't afford to feed them. But others have made deliberate choices to enter the profession as preferable to the alternatives available to them. Marie, a woman in her early 20s who has worked at Marguerite's establishment for 3 years, explains her situation with a clarity that forces Francis to reconsider his assumptions about victimhood and agency. Marie was the daughter of a poor farmer who died when she was 16, leaving her with the choice between an arranged marriage to a much older man who had already beaten 2 previous wives to death, entry into a convent where she would spend her life in unpaid labor and enforced celibacy, or work as a servant in a household where sexual exploitation would be likely but unregulated and unprotected. If I choose to help support my younger sister's education and to work under conditions where I have some protection from violence and some control over my circumstances, is it the life I would have chosen if I had been born wealthy? Of course not. But given the choices actually available to me, it was the best option. These conversations force Francis to confront the gap between abstract moral principles and concrete human realities. The women working in Marguerite's establishment are not the helpless victims or depraved sinners that his theological training had led him to expect. They are complex individuals making difficult choices within systems that offer them few alternatives, and the regulated brothel system, whatever its moral problems, provides them with better working conditions and more personal agency than most other options available to women of their social class. Francis's investigation also reveals the complex web of financial relationships that connect the licensed brothel system to supposedly respectable institutions throughout the city. The building that houses the House of the Golden Rose is owned by a wealthy merchant who also serves as a church warden. The taxes collected from licensed prostitution help fund public works projects, including the construction and maintenance of churches. Some of the regular customers are married men from prominent families whose wives presumably prefer that their husbands' extramarital activities occur in regulated establishments, rather than through affairs that might threaten family stability. Most disturbing to Francis is the discovery that several high-ranking church officials not only know about the licensed brothel system, but actively participate in its regulation and oversight. The same bishops who preach about sexual purity on Sunday are involved in municipal meetings on Tuesday, where they help establish policies for managing the very activities they condemn from the pulpit.
When Francis confronts Father Superior Augustine about these contradictions, the older monk's response reveals the sophisticated moral reasoning that allows medieval church authorities to reconcile their participation in systems they officially oppose. Father Augustine explains that the church's role is not to eliminate sin from the world, an impossible task in a fallen creation, but to minimize harm and provide opportunities for redemption within imperfect human systems.
We do not approve of prostitution, Father Augustine explains, but we recognize that prohibiting it entirely would likely lead to worse outcomes for everyone involved. By participating in the regulation of these activities, we can ensure that they occur under conditions that reduce harm, provide some protection for vulnerable women, and maintain social order that benefits the entire community. This reasoning allows church authorities to maintain their official opposition to extramarital sexuality while participating in practical governance systems that acknowledge the inevitability of such activities. It's a sophisticated form of moral reasoning that recognizes the difference between ideal principles and practical policy, though it also creates the kind of institutional hypocrisy that Francis finds deeply troubling. Francis's month-long investigation into the licensed brothel system fundamentally changes his understanding of how medieval society actually works, as opposed to how religious doctrine says it should work. He realizes that the gap between official morality and actual practice is not a sign of social corruption, but an inevitable feature of any system that attempts to govern complex human behaviors through simple moral rules. By the end of his stay in Avignon, Francis has developed a more nuanced understanding of the relationship between religious authority and secular governance. He still believes in the moral principles that brought him to the monastery, but he also understands that implementing those principles in the real world requires compromise, flexibility, and recognition of human limitations that abstract theology doesn't always acknowledge. Francis's final conversation with Marguerite reveals how much his perspective has changed during his investigation. He no longer sees her as a representative of evil corrupting an otherwise pure world, but as a businesswoman operating within systems created by the same authorities who claim to oppose her profession. The real moral complexity, he realizes, lies not in individual choices, but in social systems that create limited options and then condemn people for making the best choices available to them. But even as Francis gains a more sophisticated understanding of how medieval society manages the gap between moral ideals and human realities, he's about to discover that these contradictions extend into the most intimate aspects of daily life. Because while authorities were busy regulating professional sexuality, ordinary people were dealing with more basic challenges that make modern hygiene complaints seem trivial by comparison. Mint leaves. And your idea of dental hygiene involves rubbing your teeth with a cloth that's been used for everything from cleaning pots to wiping down livestock. Welcome to medieval romance, where love literally had to be blind because it definitely couldn't rely on the sense of smell, and where eau de toilette meant something completely different and far more alarming than it does today. If you've been following our journey through the bizarre realities of medieval intimate life, you know we don't shy away from the uncomfortable truths that make historical romance novels seem like pure fantasy. Today we're diving into one of the most fundamental challenges facing any medieval couple trying to maintain physical attraction. The simple fact that everyone smelled terrible by modern standards, and personal hygiene was somewhere between an occasional luxury and a completely foreign concept. Let's travel to the English countryside in the year 1356. To the manor house of Sir James de Ashworth, where we're about to witness one of the most diplomatically challenging conversations in medieval relationship history. Sir James is 29 years old, handsome in the way that medieval chroniclers describe as pleasing to look upon, and possessed of all the qualities that should make him an ideal husband. He's wealthy, well-connected, brave in battle, and genuinely kind-hearted. There's just one small problem that threatens to derail his engagement to Lady Eleanor de Whitmore. He smells like a combination of horse stable, unwashed wool, and what can only be described as medieval musk, a scent that would clear a modern elevator in seconds. Lady Eleanor, meanwhile, is everything a medieval noblewoman should be. Beautiful, well-educated, accomplished in music and literature, and raised with standards of cleanliness that, while primitive by modern measures, are considerably more advanced than those practiced by most of her contemporaries. She comes from a family that has maintained trading connections with Italian merchants who have introduced them to concepts like regular bathing, scented oils, and the revolutionary idea that personal cleanliness might actually be related to both health and social attractiveness. The problem becomes apparent during their first extended private conversation when Eleanor realizes that her growing affection for James's personality and character is being severely tested by the physical reality of spending time in close proximity to him. Medieval courtship typically involved formal, supervised interactions where couples maintained appropriate distances and focused on conversation rather than physical intimacy. But now that their engagement has been announced and they're spending more time together, Eleanor is discovering that romantic love might require her to literally hold her breath. The challenge facing Eleanor is both personal and social. She genuinely cares for James and doesn't want to hurt his feelings, but she also can't imagine spending the rest of her life with someone whose personal aroma makes her eyes water. More importantly, she's not sure how to address the problem without violating every social convention about appropriate feminine behavior, and potentially insulting a man who has the power to make her life very difficult if their engagement falls apart. Medieval attitudes toward bathing and personal hygiene were complex and often contradictory. On one hand, there was a general understanding that cleanliness was related to health and social status. Wealthy people were expected to maintain higher standards of personal appearance than peasants. On the other hand, there were also widespread beliefs that too much bathing could weaken the body, that cold water was dangerous to health, and that excessive attention to physical appearance was a sign of vanity and spiritual corruption. The result was a system where people bathed occasionally rather than regularly, used primitive soaps that were expensive and often harsh, and relied heavily on perfumes, herbs, and cloth coverings to mask odors rather than eliminate them. Even among the wealthy, a full bath might be a monthly event rather than a daily routine, and during winter months, bathing became even less frequent due to the practical difficulties of heating water and staying warm in drafty medieval buildings. James, like most men of his social class, has grown up with bathing habits that would horrify modern hygienists. He washes his face and hands daily, changes his linen undergarments weekly, when he remembers, and takes a complete bath perhaps once a month, or more often if he's been engaging in particularly strenuous activities like warfare or hunting. He uses soap made from animal fat and wood ash, which removes dirt but leaves his skin feeling rough and sometimes irritated. His teeth get attention when they hurt, which means he occasionally rubs them with cloth or chews on mint leaves, but the concept of daily dental care is completely foreign to him. More challenging from Eleanor's perspective is James's relationship with his clothing. Medieval garments were expensive, time-consuming to clean, and often made from materials that couldn't be washed frequently without damage. James's daily outfit includes multiple layers of wool, leather, and linen that absorb odors from his body, his activities, and his environment. These clothes are aired out, brushed, and spot-cleaned regularly, but they're not washed in the modern sense. The result is that James carries with him a complex bouquet of scents that tell the story of everything he's done in the past several weeks. Eleanor's first attempt to address the situation involves subtle hints that any modern person would recognize immediately, but that completely escape James's attention. She gives him gifts of scented oils, supposedly for use in his private chapel, but obviously intended for personal application. She arranges for their meetings to take place in garden settings,
where fresh air and flower scents might provide some relief. She even goes so far as to suggest that they visit the local monastery's herb garden together, hoping that exposure to aromatic plants might inspire him to consider their personal applications. All of these efforts fail completely because James has no context for understanding what Eleanor is trying to communicate. In his world, people smell like people, and the specific scent that each person carries is simply part of their individual identity. He's never received complaints about his personal aroma because most people in his social circle have similar hygiene habits and similar scent profiles. The idea that his smell might be offensive or problematic simply doesn't occur to him. The situation reaches a crisis point during a formal dinner at Eleanor's family home, where the close quarters and warm indoor air make James's aromatic presence impossible to ignore. Eleanor finds herself unable to eat, fighting nausea, and desperately trying to maintain social composure while seated next to her future husband. Her mother, Lady Catherine de Whitmore, notices her daughter's distress and correctly diagnoses the problem, having faced similar challenges during her own marriage negotiations 30 years earlier. Lady Catherine's solution reveals both the diplomatic skills required for medieval marriage politics and the creative problem-solving abilities of women who had to navigate delicate social situations without direct authority. She arranges for Eleanor to accidentally encounter old Martha, the local wise woman, who serves as the community's unofficial expert on herbal remedies, healthcare, and what we might now call lifestyle consulting. Old Martha is a woman in her 60s who has spent decades helping noble families solve problems that can't be addressed through official channels. She understands medieval hygiene challenges intimately, having served as an unofficial consultant on personal care for multiple generations of local aristocrats. When Eleanor explains her situation, Martha responds with the practical wisdom of someone who has seen this problem many times before. "Child," Martha says with the directness that only elderly wise women can get away with, "you're not the first bride to discover that love is easier when you can breathe through your nose. The problem is not that your young man is particularly unclean. He's probably cleaner than most knights his age. The problem is that he's never been taught that cleanliness is something a man might do for a woman he loves, rather than just something he does to avoid disease." Martha's solution involves what can only be described as a medieval makeover intervention, but one that requires careful planning to avoid insulting James or making him feel that he's being criticized for failing to meet standards he's never heard of. The strategy involves introducing him gradually to new concepts of personal care, framed not as corrections to his existing habits, but as sophisticated practices that wealthy, worldly men use to distinguish themselves from common soldiers and peasants. The intervention begins when Pietro di Firenze, an Italian merchant who regularly trades with Eleanor's family, happens to visit during one of James's stays at the manor. Pietro represents everything sophisticated about continental European culture, and his personal grooming habits reflect Italian standards that are considerably more advanced than English ones. Pietro bathes regularly, uses scented oils, pays attention to dental care, and maintains clothing that smells of herbs rather than horses. New ideas about personal care without making it seem like criticism of his existing habits. Pietro shares stories about bathing customs in Italian cities, demonstrates the use of various scented oils and herbal preparations, and explains how attention to personal appearance has become a mark of sophistication among wealthy merchants and nobles throughout southern Europe. In Florence, Pietro explains during one evening's conversation, "We have learned that the body is like a fine garment. It must be maintained carefully to preserve its beauty and function. A man who wishes to be taken seriously in business or politics pays as much attention to his personal presentation as he does to his horse or his weapons. This approach works because it frames personal hygiene as a mark of worldliness and sophistication rather than a basic requirement for social acceptability." James, who prides himself on being well-informed about international customs and political developments, becomes genuinely interested in these foreign practices as ways to enhance his social status rather than correct his personal deficiencies. Over the following weeks, James begins experimenting with new approaches to personal care, guided by Pietro's advice and Martha's herbal expertise. He starts bathing more frequently, using soaks enhanced with aromatic herbs. He pays more attention to his teeth, using mint and other herbs, not just when they hurt, but as regular maintenance. Most importantly, he begins treating his clothing differently, airing it out more frequently, using herbal sachets to keep it fresh, and even changing his linen more often. The transformation is gradual but noticeable, and Eleanor finds that her physical comfort around James improves dramatically as his personal aroma becomes less overwhelming. More importantly, she realizes that James's willingness to adopt new practices for her sake demonstrates a level of care and consideration that makes her love him more deeply, even beyond the relief of being able to breathe normally in his presence. The experience teaches both Eleanor and James something valuable about the difference between cultural standards and personal consideration. James learns that personal care can be an expression of love and respect for others, not just a matter of individual preference or social requirement. Eleanor learns that sometimes the most loving thing you can do for someone is to help them understand how their behavior affects others, even when that conversation is difficult and potentially embarrassing. Their story also illustrates the broader challenge that medieval couples faced when trying to maintain physical attraction within the constraints of primitive hygiene technology. Even couples who wanted to be clean and attractive to each other were limited by the tools and knowledge available to them. Soap was expensive and harsh. Hot water was difficult to obtain. Effective deodorants didn't exist, and dental care was primitive at best. But the more important lesson from Eleanor and James's experience is that human attraction and affection can adapt to almost any circumstances when people are willing to communicate honestly and work together to solve problems. Medieval couples might not have had access to modern hygiene products, but they did have access to creativity, compromise, and the basic human desire to please someone they cared about. Their wedding, which takes place 6 months later, is notable not just for the genuine affection between the bride and groom, but for James's transformation into one of the best groomed knights in Yorkshire. The changes in his personal care routine have become permanent habits, and Eleanor often receives compliments from other women about her husband's unusually pleasant personal presence. But even as Eleanor and James solve their hygiene challenges and build a successful marriage based on mutual consideration and adaptation, they're about to face an even more complex challenge that has puzzled couples throughout history: how to plan for the future when you have no reliable way to control whether that future includes children, and when the methods available for family planning range from ineffective to genuinely dangerous. When contraceptive advice included drinking wine mixed with beaver testicles, jumping up and down vigorously after sex, and wearing amulets made from the reproductive organs of various unfortunate animals. Welcome to medieval family planning, where preventing pregnancy required either a degree in experimental chemistry, the athletic abilities of an Olympic gymnast, or access to a zoo's worth of exotic animal parts. We're continuing our exploration of the intimate realities of medieval life, and today we're tackling one of the most universal human concerns: how to enjoy physical intimacy without necessarily committing to raising a small army of children in a world where feeding your existing family was already a constant challenge. If you're new to our series, make sure to check out our previous episodes, and don't forget to subscribe because medieval reproductive advice makes modern internet health forums look absolutely scientific by comparison. Let's journey to a small farming village outside of Canterbury in the year 1329, where we meet Johann the Miller and his wife Greta, a couple whose love story is being severely tested by mathematics. They've been married for 8 years and have 6 children, ranging in age from 7 years to 7 months. They love each other deeply. They enjoy their physical relationship, and they're absolutely terrified by the prospect of having another child, because they're already struggling to feed the ones they have. Johann is 32, a hard-working man who operates the village's grain mill and takes pride in providing for his family despite the constant economic pressures of medieval rural life. The mill provides steady work, but the income varies dramatically with the seasons, the weather, and the political stability of the region. Bad harvests mean less grain to mill, which means less income just when food prices are highest. Good harvests can mean better times, but they can also mean that Lord Geoffrey, who owns the mill,
decides to raise the rent or demand additional services from Johan's family.
Greta is 29 and exhausted in ways that go far beyond simple tiredness.
She spent the better part of a decade either pregnant, nursing, or recovering from childbirth, often while managing a household that includes not only her own children, but also Johan's elderly mother and 2 orphan nephews, whose parents died in the terrible famine of 1326. She loves her children, but she's reached the point where another pregnancy might literally kill her. And even if it doesn't, the family simply cannot afford another mouth to feed. The couple's desperation leads them to seek advice from wise woman Agnes, an elderly woman who serves as the village's unofficial doctor, midwife, veterinarian, and general consultant on any problem that requires more knowledge than the average peasant possesses. Agnes is in her 60s, with gray hair, sharp eyes, and a vast store of folk wisdom that combines genuine herbal knowledge, complete medical nonsense, and creative superstition in proportions that even she couldn't sort out. Agnes's first recommendation involves what she calls the vigorous method, which requires Greta to engage in energetic physical activity immediately after intimate relations with her husband. The theory, as Agnes explains it, is that jumping, running, or even doing handstands will prevent conception by shaking loose anything that might otherwise take hold. This advice reflects a medieval understanding of reproduction that was somewhere between primitive and completely fictional, but Agnes delivers it with the confidence of someone who has been consulted on such matters for decades. The seed must find purchase to grow, Agnes explains with the authority of someone who has clearly given this lecture many times before. If you disturb the soil immediately after planting, nothing will take root. It's the same principle farmers use when they want to clear a field of unwanted growth. The vigorous method proves to be both exhausting and ineffective. Greta spends several weeks engaging in post-coital calisthenics that leave her tired, sore, and still very much at risk of pregnancy. Johan, meanwhile, finds the whole process deeply unsexy and begins to worry that their attempts at family planning are ruining the spontaneity and pleasure that made their relationship special in the first place.
When the vigorous method fails to produce results, Agnes moves on to her herbal arsenal, which includes some of the most creative and alarming pharmaceutical advice in human history. Her first recommendation involves a tea made from pennyroyal, a mint-like herb that does have genuine contraceptive properties, but also happens to be highly toxic in anything approaching an effective dose. Agnes, working with medieval knowledge of dosage and safety, essentially recommends that Greta experiment with controlled poisoning to prevent pregnancy. The pennyroyal tea makes Greta violently ill without providing any clear contraceptive benefits, leading Agnes to conclude that perhaps a more complex herbal mixture is required. Her next recommendation involves a concoction that includes tansy, rue, ergot, and several other herbs that range from mildly toxic to potentially lethal. The preparation requires boiling these ingredients in wine during a full moon while reciting specific prayers, suggesting that Agnes views contraception as requiring both chemical and spiritual intervention. When Greta proves unable to keep down the herbal mixtures without becoming seriously ill, Agnes shifts to what she calls external methods, which involve various objects and substances applied to the body rather than consumed internally. These recommendations include linen cloths soaked in vinegar, honey mixed with crushed cedar berries, and small sponges treated with a combination of herbs and what Agnes mysteriously refers to as the essence of prevention. The external methods prove to be less dangerous than the internal ones, but they're also messy, uncomfortable, and require a level of advanced planning that makes spontaneous intimacy virtually impossible. Johan and Greta find themselves scheduling their romantic encounters around the availability of herbal preparations, the phases of the moon, and Agnes's increasingly complex instructions for proper application and timing. Meanwhile, word of Johan and Greta's family planning efforts reaches Brother Francis, the young priest who serves their village and takes his moral guidance responsibilities very seriously. Brother Francis represents the official church position on contraception, which is simple, clear, and completely uncompromising. Any attempt to prevent conception within marriage is a sin against God's command to be fruitful and multiply. Brother Francis's intervention creates a crisis of conscience for Johan and Greta, who are genuinely devout but also genuinely desperate. The priest explains that their attempts at family planning violate natural law, frustrate divine will, and demonstrate a lack of faith in God's ability to provide for whatever children He chooses to send them. He recommends that they abandon all contraceptive efforts and trust in prayer, charity, and divine providence to see them through whatever challenges additional children might bring. God will not send you more children than you can care for, Brother Francis assures them, with the confidence of someone who has never tried to feed 6 children on a miller's irregular income. If you find yourself struggling to provide for your family, perhaps you should examine whether you are living according to His will in all aspects of your lives. This spiritual counsel, however well-intentioned, provides little practical help to a couple whose immediate problem is biological rather than theological. Johann and Greta continue their consultations with Agnes, but they become more secretive about their efforts and more anxious about the spiritual implications of their family planning attempts. Agnes's next set of recommendations moves into what can only be described as medieval magical thinking, involving amulets, talismans, and various objects that are supposed to prevent pregnancy through supernatural rather than chemical means. She provides Greta with a small bag containing what she claims are the ground bones of a barren woman to be worn around the waist during intimate relations. She also recommends that Johann carry a piece of iron that has been blessed by a priest and cursed by a witch, creating what Agnes describes as spiritual contradiction that will confuse any potential pregnancy into not taking hold. The magical methods prove to be no more effective than the chemical ones, but they do provide Johann and Greta with a sense that they're doing something to address their situation, even if that something makes very little logical sense. The psychological comfort of feeling that they have some control over their reproductive future helps them cope with the anxiety of potentially facing another pregnancy they can't afford. When all of Agnes's methods fail and Greta discovers that she is indeed pregnant with her 7th child, the family faces a crisis that tests not only their financial resources but their emotional resilience and their relationship with each other. The pregnancy is difficult, complicated by Greta's exhaustion and malnutrition, and the birth nearly kills her. The baby, a daughter they name Catherine, is healthy but born into a family that is already stretched beyond its limits. Approach to family planning in ways that reflect both practical wisdom and emotional growth. They realize that their desperate attempts to prevent pregnancy have been consuming enormous amounts of time, energy, and resources that could have been better spent improving their family's actual living conditions. Instead of continuing to experiment with dangerous and ineffective contraceptive methods, they decide to focus on improving their economic situation and building the kind of social support network that will help them care for whatever children they have. Johann begins working extra hours and taking on additional jobs to increase the family's income. Greta organizes other village mothers to share childcare responsibilities and domestic work, creating an informal cooperative that helps everyone manage their household burdens more effectively. Most importantly, they adjust their approach to intimacy in ways that acknowledge both their love for each other and their realistic concerns about additional pregnancies. They don't abandon their physical relationship, but they do become more thoughtful about timing, frequency, and circumstances, using their own observations and common sense rather than Agnes's increasingly desperate remedies. The couple also develops a more nuanced relationship with religious authority, continuing to respect church teachings while also recognizing that spiritual guidance doesn't always address practical problems effectively. They maintain their faith and their participation in religious life, but they also accept that some decisions require human wisdom and personal responsibility rather than blind adherence to external authority. Johann and Greta's story reflects the broader challenge that medieval families faced when trying to balance love, desire, economic reality, and social expectations. The methods available to them for controlling family size were primitive, dangerous, and largely ineffective, but their need to limit their fertility was genuine and pressing. Most medieval couples dealt with this challenge through some combination of folk remedies, timing, prayer, and acceptance of whatever outcomes resulted from their efforts. The ineffectiveness of medieval contraception meant that family planning was often less about preventing pregnancy and more about spacing births, improving maternal health,
and managing family resources more effectively. Couples learn to work within biological and economic constraints rather than trying to overcome them entirely, developing strategies for survival and prosperity that acknowledge the reality of large families in resource-limited environments. But even as Johann and Greta learn to manage their family planning challenges through practical wisdom and mutual support, they're about to discover that their community has its own ways of dealing with couples whose romantic impulses get ahead of their marriage plans. Because while the church preached abstinence before marriage, the reality of medieval courtship often involved considerably more experimentation than official morality cared to acknowledge. Their neighbors, Robin and Mary, are about to provide a perfect example of what happened when medieval couples decided to test the waters before making their relationship official, and the consequences revealed just how much medieval society relied on flexible enforcement of supposedly absolute moral standards. A one-way ticket to eternal damnation. There existed a dirty little secret that medieval authorities preferred not to discuss too loudly. Most couples were sampling the merchandise long before they walked down the aisle. The medieval equivalent of try before you buy was alive and well, hidden behind a complex system of fines, forced marriages, and what can only be described as the world's first retroactive marriage licenses. Welcome back to our journey through the contradictions of medieval love and lust. We've explored privacy problems, church restrictions, marriage negotiations, and family planning disasters. And now we're diving into one of the most widespread but least discussed aspects of medieval relationships: the gap between what people were supposed to do and what they actually did when nobody was watching. Hit that subscribe button because today's episode reveals just how modern medieval people really were when it came to matters of the heart and other body parts. Let's travel to the village of Little Wickford in Dorset, England in the year 1398, where we meet Robin Carpenter and Mary Fletcher, two young people whose love story is about to become the talk of the village for all the wrong reasons. Robin is 22, a skilled woodworker who has recently completed his apprenticeship and established his own small business, making furniture, tools, and household items for the local community. He's handsome in a practical way, with strong hands, an easy smile, and the kind of steady personality that makes parents think good husband material when they look at him. Mary is 19, the daughter of the village Fletcher who makes arrows for hunters and soldiers. She's intelligent, spirited, and possessed of the kind of beauty that makes young men suddenly find excuses to need new arrows even when their quivers are already full. More importantly, she's reached the age where her father is actively considering marriage proposals, and Robin has been working up the courage to approach him about formal courtship arrangements. The problem is that Robin and Mary have been conducting their own unofficial courtship for months, meeting secretly in the woods outside the village, sharing increasingly intimate conversations, and more recently, increasingly intimate physical contact. They're deeply in love, fully intend to marry as soon as Robin can afford the bride price and secure permission from Mary's father, and have convinced themselves that their premarital activities are acceptable because their intentions are honorable and their eventual marriage is virtually certain. This reasoning reflects a common medieval attitude toward premarital relationships that historians call handfasting or betrothal by consent. Many couples considered themselves married in the eyes of God once they had declared their intention to wed, even if the formal ceremony and legal paperwork hadn't been completed yet. This informal marriage gave them a moral framework for physical intimacy that satisfied their consciences while creating potential legal complications if anything went wrong with their plans. Robin and Mary's secret meetings take place in a small clearing in Whitford Forest, about a mile from the village, where they feel safe from the prying eyes of neighbors and the moral supervision of church authorities. They've been meeting there for 3 months, initially just to talk and hold hands, but gradually becoming more physically affectionate as their emotional connection deepens and their wedding plans become more concrete. Their downfall comes courtesy of Sarah Gossip, a middle-aged widow whose unofficial job in the village is knowing everyone else's business and sharing it with anyone who will listen. Sarah has noticed Mary's frequent trips to gather herbs in the forest, observed Robin's tendency to disappear from his workshop at the same times, and put together a theory about their activities that proves to be embarrassingly accurate. Sarah's investigation into Robin and Mary's relationship reveals something important about medieval community dynamics and social control. Villages like Little Wickford operated on the principle that everyone's business was everyone's business, particularly when it came to matters that might affect community stability, moral standards, or local reputation. Young people conducting secret romantic relationships represented a potential threat to parental authority. Church doctrine and the carefully negotiated marriage politics that kept rural communities functioning smoothly. When Sarah finally catches Robin and Mary in what medieval legal documents euphemistically described as a compromising situation, the discovery sets off a chain of events that reveals the complex machinery of medieval moral enforcement. Sarah doesn't just keep the information to herself or even share it casually with her friends. She reports it directly to Duncan the Reeve, the village official responsible for maintaining law and order and ensuring that local behavior conforms to both secular and religious standards. Duncan finds himself in a position that modern law enforcement officers would recognize. He's required to investigate and potentially prosecute behavior that's technically illegal, but widely practiced, morally condemned, but practically tolerated, and officially prohibited, but unofficially expected. Medieval authorities had developed sophisticated ways of dealing with these contradictions, but the process was never simple or straightforward. The first step in the official response involves what medieval records call inquiry and examination, which means that Duncan has to gather evidence, interview witnesses, and determine exactly what Robin and Mary have been doing and for how long. This process is both invasive and embarrassing for everyone involved, since it requires explicit discussion of intimate activities that would normally never be mentioned in polite society. Duncan's investigation reveals that Robin and Mary's relationship has progressed considerably beyond the innocent hand-holding and shy conversations that might be overlooked or handled with a gentle warning. They have been engaging in what medieval law considers fornication, sexual activity between unmarried people, for several weeks, and their behavior has been observed by multiple witnesses who can testify to their guilt in any formal proceedings. The legal situation is complicated by several factors that make Robin and Mary's case more complex than a simple moral violation. First, they are genuinely betrothed to each other and have declared their intention to marry, which gives them a stronger moral position than couples who are simply engaging in casual sexual activity. Second, both families approve of the eventual marriage, which means that the relationship has semi-official sanction even if the formal arrangements haven't been completed. Third, no pregnancy has resulted from their activities, which eliminates one of the most serious potential consequences of premarital sex. When the case comes before Judge William de Montfort, the traveling magistrate who handles serious legal matters for the region, Robin and Mary face potential punishments that range from financial fines and public penance to forced immediate marriage or even imprisonment. Medieval law took premarital sex seriously, not just for moral reasons, but because it threatened the social and economic systems that depended on controlled, negotiated marriages between families. Judge William, however, proves to be a practical man who understands the difference between letter of the law and the spirit of justice. He's seen dozens of cases like Robin and Mary's during his years of circuit riding through rural England, and he's developed a nuanced approach to dealing with couples whose hearts and bodies have gotten ahead of their paperwork. Young man, Judge William addresses Robin during the formal hearing. You stand accused of engaging in intimate relations with this woman before receiving the blessing of the church and the legal sanction of marriage. How do you answer these charges? Robin's response reveals both his genuine love for Mary and his understanding of the legal and social realities he's facing. Your Honor, I confess that Mary and I have been intimate, but I also declare before God and this court that I intend to marry her, that our families approve of this union, and that our actions were motivated by love and commitment rather than by lust or disrespect for proper authority. This answer demonstrates the medieval legal concept of mitigating circumstances, factors that don't eliminate guilt, but do reduce the severity of punishment. Robin is essentially arguing that while he and Mary have technically violated the law,
they have done so within a framework of honorable intentions that makes their behavior less threatening to social order than it might otherwise appear. Mary's testimony supports Robin's position while also revealing the emotional and practical pressures that led to their premature intimacy. Your Honor, Robin and I love each other truly, and we have waited months for our families to complete the negotiations that will allow us to marry. We could not bear to wait longer to express our affection, and we believed that our sincere intention to wed made our actions acceptable in the eyes of God. Judge Williams' decision reflects the flexible enforcement that characterized much of medieval law when it came to moral violations. Rather than imposing the maximum penalties available to him, he chooses to treat Robin and Mary's case as an opportunity for restorative rather than punitive justice. Actions occurred within a context of genuine affection and honorable intentions, Judge William announces. Therefore, the court orders that you shall be married within 1 month, that you shall pay a fine of 2 shillings to the church for the moral violation, and that you shall perform public penance by attending special services for 3 consecutive Sundays. This sentence accomplishes several important objectives while avoiding the harshest possible punishment. The forced immediate marriage ensures that Robin and Mary's relationship is brought into legal and religious compliance, removing the ongoing threat to social order that their unofficial union represented. The fine provides appropriate punishment for their violation, while also contributing funds to the church. The public penance serves as both personal consequence and community warning about the results of premarital sexual activity. Most importantly, Judge Williams' decision reflects a practical understanding that Robin and Mary's love is genuine and their eventual marriage inevitable, making harsh punishment counterproductive for everyone involved. By forcing them to marry immediately, rather than waiting for their families to complete lengthy negotiations, he actually speeds up a process that would have happened anyway, while ensuring that their physical relationship occurs within socially sanctioned boundaries. The wedding of Robin and Mary takes place 3 weeks later in the village church, with most of the community in attendance, despite the somewhat scandalous circumstances that made it necessary. The ceremony is simple but heartfelt, and the obvious genuine affection between the bride and groom helps overcome any social awkwardness about the rushed timeline. Their story illustrates several important truths about medieval attitudes toward premarital sexuality. First, while such behavior was officially condemned, it was widely practiced and often tolerated when it occurred within the context of serious romantic relationships. Second, medieval communities had developed sophisticated mechanisms for dealing with moral violations that balanced punishment with practical considerations and social stability. Third, the gap between official moral standards and actual behavior was acknowledged and managed, rather than ignored or denied. Robin and Mary's experience also reveals the complex interplay between individual desire, family authority, and community standards that shaped medieval relationships. Young people had more agency in their romantic lives than popular stereotypes suggest, but they also faced real consequences when their choices violated social expectations or legal requirements. Most medieval couples who engaged in premarital intimacy never faced formal legal proceedings because their behavior either went undetected or was handled through informal community pressure rather than official punishment. But when cases did come to official attention, the response was typically more flexible and practical than modern people might expect from a supposedly rigid and moralistic society. The reality of medieval sexual behavior was far more complex and human than either religious authorities or modern stereotypes would suggest. People fell in love, expressed that love physically, and found ways to navigate the gap between their desires and their society's expectations. The system worked not because it prevented premarital sexuality, but because it provided mechanisms for incorporating such behavior into socially acceptable frameworks when necessary. As Robin and Mary settle into married life and become respected members of their community, their early experience with moral complexity prepares them for the final challenge that every medieval couple eventually faced: learning to find and sustain love within a social system that treated romance as a luxury rather than a necessity. The virginity trials, the mythical chastity belts, the licensed brothels, the hygiene disasters, the dangerous contraception attempts, and the premarital relationship scandals
You might be wondering whether genuine love was even possible in medieval Europe. The answer, surprisingly and beautifully, is yes. Despite every obstacle that society, religion, economics, and basic sanitation could throw at them, medieval people still managed to find, nurture, and sustain the kind of deep, lasting love that poets write about and that modern couples still aspire to achieve. This is our final stop on the journey through medieval romance, and today we're exploring the most remarkable discovery of all, that love truly does find a way, even in the most restrictive and challenging circumstances imaginable. If you've been following our series, you know that medieval love stories are far more complex and inspiring than any fairy tale, because they were built not on fantasy, but on the daily choice to care for another person regardless of what the world demanded of you. Let's visit the prosperous market town of Stratford-upon-Avon in the year 1402, where we meet Master Peter de Coventry, a successful cloth merchant, and Dame Catherine de Ashworth, his wife of 15 years. Their story isn't one of dramatic passion or forbidden romance. It's something much rarer and more valuable. It's the story of how two people who married for practical reasons gradually discovered that they had built something precious together, something that transcended the economic and social arrangements that brought them together in the first place. Peter is 41 years old, a practical man who inherited his father's cloth business and expanded it through careful management, strategic partnerships, and an honest reputation that makes other merchants trust him with their most valuable transactions. When he married Catherine 16 years ago, it was because her family's connections to Flemish weavers would give him access to higher quality wool and better trade routes. Love wasn't part of the equation. It was a business alliance that happened to involve sharing a bed and a household. Catherine is 38, the daughter of a minor baron who needed to marry her off advantageously to pay his debts and secure his family's future. When she accepted Peter's proposal, she was looking for security, respectability, and a chance to manage her own household rather than remain dependent on her family's increasingly precarious finances. She hoped for kindness from her husband, but expected little more than courteous coexistence and the eventual production of children who would secure both their legacies. What neither Peter nor Catherine anticipated was how their daily partnership would gradually transform into something much deeper and more meaningful than either of them had thought to hope for. The change didn't happen overnight. It developed slowly, through thousands of small interactions, shared challenges, mutual support during difficult times, and the gradual recognition that they had become genuinely fond of each other as people rather than just accepting each other as spouses. The transformation began during their third year of marriage, when a series of bad harvests and political instability threatened Peter's business and put their entire household at financial risk. Instead of treating this crisis as Peter's problem to solve alone, Catherine threw herself into helping save their livelihood, using her education and social connections to find new markets for their goods and negotiate better terms with their suppliers. During the long evenings they spent working together over account books and correspondence, Peter began to appreciate Catherine's intelligence, her quick grasp of complex business problems, and her ability to charm difficult customers into favorable agreements. Catherine, meanwhile, discovered that Peter was not just competent, but genuinely decent, that he valued her opinions and treated her as a partner rather than just as a wife who happened to be useful in business situations. Their personal breakthrough came during Catherine's fourth pregnancy, when complications threatened both her life and the life of their unborn child. Peter's response to this crisis revealed the depth of his feelings in ways that surprised both of them. He spent weeks barely leaving her bedside, caring for her personally rather than delegating the task to servants, and making it clear that her survival mattered more to him than the fate of their business, their social standing, or anything else in his life. I realized during those terrible weeks, Catherine would later tell her daughter, that somewhere along the way, I had stopped being a convenient wife and had become someone he genuinely couldn't bear to lose. And I realized that the thought of leaving him and our children was breaking my heart, not just because of duty or fear, but because I had come to love him in ways I never expected when we first married. The child, a daughter they named Margaret, survived, and Catherine's recovery marked the beginning of a new phase in their relationship. They had discovered that shared crisis had revealed feelings they hadn't known they possessed, and they began to approach their marriage as an opportunity for genuine companionship rather than just successful partnership. Their love story continues to unfold against the backdrop of medieval daily life, where romance must coexist with practical concerns like managing a household of 12 people, including children, servants, apprentices, and elderly relatives. Peter and Catherine learn to find moments of intimacy and affection within the constant demands of medieval domestic life, developing their own private language of glances, touches, and shared jokes that help them maintain their connection, even when they're surrounded by other people. Their relationship is witnessed and influenced by David, a young minstrel who regularly performs at the homes of Stratford's merchant families and who has a gift for observing the subtle dynamics of long-term relationships. David is in his 20s, romantic by nature, and initially skeptical about the possibility of finding true love within the constraints of arranged marriage and medieval social expectations. "I came to their household expecting to see the polite tolerance that I observed in most merchant marriages," David later writes in his journal. "Instead, I discovered something that challenged everything I thought I knew about love and marriage." Peter and Catherine had created something genuine and lasting, not despite their practical beginnings, but because of them. They had learned to love each other not in the passionate, overwhelming way that troubadours sing about, but in the deeper, more sustainable way that allows two people to build a life together. David's observations of Peter and Catherine's relationship become the foundation for a new type of love song, one that celebrates the quiet, daily expressions of affection that sustain long-term partnerships, rather than the dramatic, often doomed passions that dominated most medieval romantic literature. His songs about married love become popular throughout the region, offering couples a new way to think about the romantic potential within their own practical relationships. The couple's approach to love is also influenced by their friendship with Geoffrey and Margaret Longwood, an elderly couple who have been married for 42 years and who serve as informal mentors to younger couples in the community. Geoffrey and Margaret represent the possibility of love that grows stronger rather than weaker over time. And their relationship provides Peter and Catherine with a model for what their own marriage might become, with patience, commitment, and continued mutual respect. The secret, Margaret tells Catherine during one of their regular conversations, is not to expect your husband to be the same person he was when you married him, or to remain the same person yourself. People change, and love must change with them. The Peter you married is not the Peter you have now. And that's not a failure, it's an opportunity. The question is whether you can learn to love the person he's becoming as much as you loved the person he was. This wisdom proves particularly valuable as Peter and Catherine navigate the challenges of middle age, watching their children grow into independent adults, dealing with the deaths of parents and friends, and facing their own physical and emotional changes. They learn that sustainable love requires not just initial attraction or compatibility, but the ongoing willingness to discover new things to appreciate about each other as circumstances change. Their love is tested and strengthened by external challenges that require them to work together as a team. When political conflicts disrupt trade routes and threaten their business, they develop new strategies together. When plague reaches their region and threatens their community, they coordinate their household's response to protect their family and help their neighbors. When their eldest son makes a disastrous marriage that brings shame and financial liability to the family, they present a united front in dealing with the crisis while supporting each other through the emotional stress. Through each challenge, Peter and Catherine discover that their partnership has evolved into something much stronger than the sum of its practical parts. They have become genuinely fond of each other's company, protective of each other's well-being, and committed to each other's happiness in ways that go far beyond the legal and social obligations of marriage. Playful, comfortable, and genuinely affectionate. They learn to please each other not just as a marital duty, but as an expression of their growing emotional connection. Their bedroom becomes a place of refuge and reconnection, rather than just a location for the production of children and the fulfillment of obligations. The community around them begins to recognize Peter and Catherine as an example of what marriage can become when two people commit, not just to staying together, but to growing together. Young couples seek their advice, and older couples point to them as proof that love and compatibility can develop within even the most practical marital arrangements. Their story illustrates several important truths about medieval love that challenge modern assumptions about historical relationships. First, the absence of romantic love as a basis for marriage didn't prevent couples from developing deep affection and genuine partnership over time. Second, medieval people were just as capable of emotional growth, psychological intimacy, and sustained affection as modern couples, even within social systems that didn't prioritize these things. Third, love that develops gradually through shared experience and mutual respect often proves more durable than love that begins with intense passion but lacks practical foundation. Peter and Catherine's relationship also demonstrates the medieval understanding that love is as much about choice and commitment as it is about feeling and attraction. They choose to be kind to each other, to support each other's goals, to find humor in their shared challenges, and to maintain physical and emotional intimacy, even when practical demands make it difficult. Their love grows not because it was destined or because they were perfectly matched, but because they work at it consistently and generously. As they enter their later years together, Peter and Catherine become grandparents whose own grandchildren will grow up seeing daily examples of affection, respect, and genuine partnership between husband and wife. Their influence extends beyond their immediate family to the broader community, where their relationship serves as proof that medieval marriage could be a source of genuine happiness and fulfillment rather than just social and economic necessity. Their final years together are marked not by the passionate drama of young love, but by the deep satisfaction of two people who have built something lasting and meaningful together. They have learned to love not just the idea of each other, but the reality, including the flaws, changes, and disappointments that come with any long-term relationship. When Peter dies first, at the age of 63, Catherine's grief is profound and genuine, surprising even her with its intensity. She realizes that somewhere along the way, the practical partnership she had entered into as a young woman had become the central relationship of her life, and that she had been genuinely happy in ways she never expected when she first accepted his proposal. And so we reach the end of our journey through the intimate lives of medieval lovers, having discovered that despite every obstacle, social, religious, economic, and hygienic, love found ways to flourish. Medieval people faced challenges that would test any relationship, but they also possessed something that modern couples sometimes lack: the understanding that love is not just a feeling, but a practice, not just a discovery, but a creation, not just a lucky accident, but a daily choice to care for another person regardless of what the world demands of you. Judgmental chickens, and hygiene that would clear a modern elevator. Thomas and Agnes, Isabella and Alfonso, Emma and Robert, they all prove that human nature hasn't changed much in 700 years. We're still figuring out love, still breaking rules for it, and still finding ways to make it work against impossible odds. If tonight's deep dive into medieval romance kept you entertained while you're trying to fall asleep, you're in exactly the right place. Here at Boring Sleepless History, we specialize in the stories they didn't teach you in school, the messy, funny, surprisingly relatable human truths hidden behind the sanitized version of the past. We've got 10 more episodes in this medieval love series coming your way. Plus, fascinating rabbit holes into everything from ancient Roman bathroom etiquette to Victorian death photography. Hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell, because history is a lot more interesting when you learn what people were actually doing behind closed doors. And if this episode made you laugh, cringe, or feel grateful for modern dating apps, show some love with a like. It helps other insomniacs find these stories too. Drop a comment about which historical period you'd most want to avoid dating in, because trust me, every era had its own special brand of romantic disasters. Sweet dreams, and remember, no matter how complicated your love life feels, at least you don't have to schedule it around a medieval church calendar or worry about a chicken named Blue Hilda interrupting your intimate moments.